Welcome, everyone, to the 14th episode of the weekly series, Viewing Multidimensional Poverty from Many Angles. I'm James Foster, co-director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP as we call it here, at the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. I'm joined by my co-moderator and co-author, Sabina Alkire, who unfortunately is moving in and out of the blogosphere due to bad connections in Bhutan. She is the director of Oxford's Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, in the Department of International Development of Oxford University. And along with our colleagues from UNDP's Human Development Report Office, we're really pleased to present today's discussion, Disaggregating the Global MPI by Ethnicity, an empirical discussion that makes use of a key property of the MPI, allowing policymakers to see who is being left behind and then to close the gap. Today, we have a fabulous panel of presenters, including Fanni Kovesdi of OPHI, with Sabina in a supporting role, and Maren Jiménez of UN's Department for Economic and Social Affairs, or UNDESA. Our discussant for today is Rachel Gisselquist of UNU-WIDER, who is well acquainted with horizontal or group-based inequalities. In just a moment, I'll ask Sabina to describe the series and introduce the other speakers. But first, a few words about our institute. IIEP is a catalyst for cutting-edge research on key questions facing the international community, including inequality, climate change, and of course, multidimensional poverty. We also teach and convene events such as today's. Last week was a busy one with an event every day and GW's graduate ceremonies over the weekend. Last Monday in this series, Yashwis Matsu Bogali of the World Bank discussed the use of the MPI in the context of forced displacement, while next Monday we'll bring Dr. Niluka Wijakun of the World Health Organization discussing the use of multidimensional poverty and vulnerability indices in the context of health emergencies, with a discussion by Juan Daniel Oviedo, the chief statistician of Colombia. This will be the 15th and final episode in the present series, which has brought together folks from the UN system, other international organizations, and people in academia to discuss the many uses of multidimensional poverty measures and other multidimensional measures in actually making a difference in the world. Next week, we'll have on the 15th, on the 26th of May, we'll continue our Rethinking in Capitalism and Democracy series with an amazing author and my own professor, Bob Frank, showing how behavioral economics can be harnessed in policy choices and contagion, the COVID pandemic and the climate crisis. Don't miss this important event, but if you have to miss it, you can watch the rerun on our YouTube channel, IIEP GW. Now, rather than discuss biographies in a lengthy way, I'm simply going to turn it over to our hosts, our speakers today, that is, and let them immediately start in. I'll begin with Fanni. Fanni, would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, James. Let me just share my screen. Okay, hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining today. The work I will be presenting is on the ethnicity disaggregation of the global MPI. So this is very much a joint work with Sabina Alkire and also Corinne Mitchell, and it builds on the work by Usha Kanagaratham and Nikolai Supa, who have made the global MPI dataset available to us. So let me start with a quick overview. So this work is very much a work in progress, and we're hoping to this year take this work further and extend it to more countries. The idea is behind this work is very much centered on the Leaving No One Behind message that is central to the Agenda 2030, aiming to promote social and economic political inclusion across all of society, irrespective of socio-demographic characteristics, one of which is ethnicity. The global MPI already disaggregates multidimensional poverty statistics by age group, subnational region, and urban and rural area. And we add to this by the disaggregation focused on ethnicity. The Sustainable Development Goals require countries to measure poverty and also to disaggregate it. And one of which disaggregation is the ethnicity disaggregation, which features in some of the national measures, such as the National MPI for Mexico, or it features in tailored measures such as the Indigenous MPI in Colombia, and all of which is important as measurement can enable policymakers to really focus on reducing these intergroup inequalities and thereby ensuring that no one is left behind. Another important aspect related to the ethnic and intergroup inequalities is the body of work that has been put out by Francis Stewart and colleagues throughout the last couple of decades, focusing on horizontal inequalities. I believe much of this will be discussed in the subsequent presentations, but the importance is that these ethnic inequalities not only prohibit people to live life to the fullest, but can also be a catalyst for conflict and violence if combined with particular characteristics such as political and economic inequality across groups. So our focus today is on the global MPI, which measures multidimensional poverty using 3 dimensions: health, education, and living standards, and 10 non-monetary indicators of poverty. The global MPI is based on the DHS and mixed surveys, and as I mentioned, is already disaggregated by age group, area, and subnational region. And to this, we add a new disaggregation by ethnicity of the household head. So in the current slide, you can see the 24 countries for which we were able to disaggregate. These cover the regions of Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe and Central Asia, East Asia and Pacific, and Latin America. Unfortunately, with the current data availability and the requirements that I will show in the subsequent slides, we're not able to capture any countries in the Arab States region or in South Asia for now. One of the important data limitations around ethnicity is how do we define ethnicity? So for our study, we have used the quite strict operationalization of ethnicity and ethnic group and tribe-based questions, therefore not including anything that is related to language or nationality, just to keep it comparable across countries as we're aiming for a global coverage. However, that is not yet sufficient. So to operationalize it, we focus on the ethnicity of the household head. And this is important as it's a self-reported, so participants are asked to state their ethnicity. And if this is not available, we use the ethnicity of the oldest member for DHS surveys. And we follow the disaggregations that are shown in the tables of the survey report to ensure that this, so to the 24 countries that we cover are home to 650 million people, and 46% of those people are MPI poor, which covers nearly 300 million. Some of you who may know the global MPI, you know that the global MPI covers over 100 countries. So compared to that, our coverage is still fairly low with 24 countries. However, we hope to expand this year and in the upcoming years. The countries covered here also have a wide range of poverty conditions, with the poorest country being Chad, while in Kazakhstan, multidimensional poverty is fairly low. We cover a total of 192 ethnic groupings, again with large variation. In some ethnic groupings, all people are poor, so 100% of the people in Chad, for instance, are poor, while in the smallest other groups in Guyana, Moldova, and Trinidad and Tobago, there is no one who is deprived, who is multidimensionally poor. I wanted to take a moment before results to discuss the concept around ethnicity. It is very well in measurement. We often operationalize these terms, but these are very real identities that can be a source of pride, but also stigma, discrimination, and conflict and inequality for many. And we want to be aware that while we use these categories, we know that these are socially constructed and often have historical and political roots and has been used for certain stratifications of society. However, they're still important and they have very much context dependent, which makes the boundaries of ethnicity across societies and global comparison much more difficult. So in our case, ethnic groups tend to be, the kind of generic definition tends to be that ethnic groups are often defined based on common ancestry, culture, language, and tradition, among others. However, as I mentioned, we strictly use the questions that ask, what is your ethnicity? What is your ethnic tribe? For this disaggregation. And we use self-identification as opposed to ascribed identities. However, that's something worth keeping in mind as we interpret results, as well as that people also can take on multiple identities and can have dominant and non-dominant identities as they live their lives or as they move around. So to move on to the results first, first you can see here's just, let me show you. Whoops, okay. Yes, so here's the disparities across ethnic groups in terms of the lowest and highest disparity. So we can see on the left, we have the countries where the disparity across ethnic group is the smallest. So this is Kazakhstan, Trinidad, Tobago, North Macedonia. And as we move on to the right towards countries such as Kenya, Togo, or Gabon, you can see that the difference between some of the ethnic groups can be as much as 85%, with some of the groups having 90% of their population, while others are living only 5% multidimensionally poor. This is important to keep in mind when we look at the leaving no one behind message and trying to ensure that all segments of society get appropriate policies that ensure them to progress. And to kind of zoom in on some of the pockets of poverty that exist, here I'm showing two examples. One on the left is Belize, where we can see that the Maya ethnic group and the other ethnic group, which make up both about 10 to 12% of the population, have much higher levels of poverty as opposed to the Creole, Mestizo, and Garifuna ethnic groups. So in the case of the Maya, their headcount ratio, or the proportion of the people in poverty, is about 20%, while in the Creole group, it's about 2%. And similarly, we have Moldova, where we see that the majority of the population have zero poverty. However, the Roma ethnic group has a much substantial, about nearly 25% of the population is multidimensionally poor. However, based on the questionnaire and based on the self-identification, they make up less than 1% of the population. So it could be that in a lot of the cases, they're not detected as they only make up such a small percent of the population. However, they're being left behind and they have much higher levels of poverty than the rest of the country. So this is important to show this and to highlight this for policy making purposes. Another interesting analysis that the global MPI data enables is to compare the population shares and the distribution of the poverty between majority and minority ethnic groups. So this example is with Nigeria, where we can see that the Hausa ethnic group, they make up about 50% of the population. However, despite being the majority ethnic group, they account for 71%, and 71% of their population lives in multidimensional poverty. This is in contrast with the Yoruba or the Igbo, who together make up about 22% of the population. However, they only account for about 6% of all multidimensionally poor people. So this is a really interesting dynamic, and something that is worth highlighting as we are comparing countries, that this can be probably explained by some of the political political situation in the country, as in a lot of the countries with multiple ethnic groups and no dominant groups, the majority ethnic group is not always the less poor. There's another example here with Lao, where we see that 62% of the population of Lao is from the Lao Thai ethnic group, and however, they only account for about 30% of all multidimensionally poor people, while the Mon Khmer group, who account for about 1/4 of the population, account for nearly half of all multidimensionally poor. So these are very interesting dynamics, and these are important to consider when we are looking at how to reduce inequalities across ethnic groups in the different countries. Another interesting dynamic is the cross-border differences that we see in some of the countries. So here we have the headcount ratio, both at the national level and among the Akan ethnic group in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. And what we can see that despite that the ethnic group living, a single ethnic group in two different countries can have different percentage of their population living in poverty. And this is something to explore further, why this is the case and why we're seeing that in Cote d'Ivoire, a higher percentage of the Akan are multidimensionally poor, and they also have a higher intensity of poverty by about 5 percentage points. And lastly, the global MPI can also show us the percentage contribution of indicators to poverty, which is very useful for policymaking. So here is an example of Gabon with the different ethnic groups and the composition of their poverty. So the red, the lighter and darker red bars at the bottom show the percentage contribution of the health dimension to multidimensional poverty, while the brown or light pink show the contribution of the education dimension, and the blue show the contribution of the living standards indicators to multidimensional poverty. And we can see quite a variation. In the case of the Baka ethnic group, we can see that education, especially years of schooling, has a much larger contribution to their poverty, as opposed to the Fang ethnic group, whose poverty is largely composed of deprivations in nutrition and child mortality, which make up nearly 50% of the total contribution. So again, these are interesting dynamics that can be used to target policy and to ensure that we are reducing these inequalities and aiming to target the deprivations that are relevant to each ethnic group. And to conclude, I would just like to highlight that while we have only covered 24 countries, we believe that the global MPI and especially its extension to more countries can shed light on the ethnic inequalities that are present in poverty and how some of the groups are being left behind. It can also show us the level of and composition of poverty and help identify the poorest groups that will enable us to target and design policies and ensure no one is being left behind. However, some of the constraints remain, such as the small number of countries covered, and therefore we yet to have global coverage of ethnicity, the segregation. There is a large heterogeneity between the groups, both in terms of the number of ethnic groups across countries, which can vary from 2 or 3 in some countries such as Vietnam to over 10 in countries such as Chad. And obviously the population share, as I've shown with the Roma, we have a very small percentage of the population in Moldova, which makes analysis and definite results difficult. And we also have the limitations around the ethnicity of the household head, which we're currently using. This does not enable us to look at intra-household inequalities. Some few questions perhaps to discuss, and some of the questions which we're hoping to answer with our upcoming work is how these ethnicity disaggregations from the global MPI can add to the existing studies, how and whether the MPI may overlook important cultural differences in poverty. We would also like to look at why some countries have low inequalities across ethnic groups, and why the same ethnic groups, such as the ACAN, can have different levels of MPI across national boundaries. And finally, how the composition of poverty and appropriate can be used for policy making and to enable us a closer look at poverty. Thank you. I don't know, Sabina, if you have anything to add, you managed to join.
No, thank you very much, Fanny. That was a great presentation, and apologies that I could not join earlier. Just to introduce Fanny ex post, she's a research analyst at OPHI, and she led and co-led work on harmonizing data on changes over time for 5 billion people in 75, 80 countries last year. And she has been then working on this ethnicity work. I think I would only add to her concluding remarks 3 questions, which are really questions to the audience and to the co-presenters, and then we'll move on and very much look forward to Maren and to Rachel's inputs. One question about this ethnicity study is if there are questions that we are missing. So since this very early disaggregation study was done, of course, issues of racial tensions have been very much in the media, but also there have been a plethora of studies. And as James said, we are co-hosting these seminars with the Human Development Report Office with Jan Chun, Heriberto, and Cecilia, and other colleagues are on this call, and really wanting to deepen this work and make it policy salient, make it really speaking into some of these issues insofar as the very limited data, as Fanny pointed out, can do so. So suggestions are most warmly welcome. The second is an ethical question. We all know that these topics are also sensitive, and our first mandate is to do no harm. So thinking about how to do this research in a way that's genuinely constructive and doesn't inflame tensions would be very, very welcome. And the third is really to hear policy relevance of these studies. As Fanny suggested, knowing the composition, knowing the disparities seems to be interesting, but we would be very interested to hear what others are already doing in terms of using this information to mobilize policies. We know some of what countries in Latin America are doing when they have highlighted the differential levels and composition of poverty among indigenous groups, but it would be fascinating afterwards to hear more. And so we now very much turn this over to Maren Jiménez from UNDESA, and we are very grateful to UNDESA because it was really their interest that helped to animate and motivate our own research on this topic. Maria Jiménez is the Social Affairs Officer in UNDESA, and so she's part of the writing team of what used to be called the Report on the World Social Situation and is now called the World Social Report. And it's the flagship publication of the UN on social development issues. And so we're really, really grateful for her insights. And before taking this position, she also worked in Addis Ababa and Bangkok and Santiago de Chile in different regional commissions of the UN. So welcome, Maren, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sabina. Good morning from New York, and many thanks to you and the organizers for the invitation to join today's event. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. And again, thank you so much. I mean, our thanks to you too for the conversations that we've had around using data on ethnicity to disaggregate these development indicators. And so it's really my pleasure to speak a little bit more about how we use the MPI and DESA's work more generally on conceptualizing and measuring group-based inequality, including our own use of disaggregated race data disaggregated by race and ethnicity. And there'll be a lot of similarities together with what Fanni just presented, I will say that I'll refer primarily to the analysis that we've published in the World Social Report. The last one came out in early 2020, and where we had a great specific focus on inequalities, and so devoted a lot of space to group-based inequalities, including by race and ethnicity. I won't go by the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, although this is a required slide for any DESA presentation, since it frames all of our work since member states adopted it in 2015. But specifically to Sustainable Development Goal 10 on reducing inequality within and among countries. Because just to make the point again that the overall focus on inequality in the SDGs is one of the innovations of this agenda from previous global development agendas. It not only includes a standalone goal on reducing inequality, but also in adopting the agenda and its goals, member states pledged to leave no one behind, as Fanni mentioned. And this is really a move forward from previous efforts that focused on indicators at the national level that hid significant disparities between people and places within national borders. So really we see that determining who is being left behind and in what ways people are excluded is key to the 2030 agenda implementation. You'll see, Fanni had this as well in Target 10.2, the agenda already gives us and identifies many of the societal fault lines that lead to unequal distribution of resources, opportunities, voice, and power within a country, age and sex, but also race, disability status, ethnicity, migrant origin, religion, economic or other status. The overall goal 10 is on reducing inequality, but you'll see Target 10.2 has a focus on inclusion. And so in our work, we have considered inequalities across multiple indicators between different social groups as symptoms of social exclusion of that group. Definitely, we agree that you need to document these inequalities as a first step to redressing them. For us, we have approached it in terms of knowing who is left behind requires measures of identity or ascribed characteristics. I should mention these are self-reported. Data on outcomes, like I mentioned, resource opportunities, power, voice, agency, to identify where the inequalities lie. And we've put a focus on trends over time. So to determine if some groups are being left behind in the sense that there's stagnation, that they're not benefiting equally from the development process, that there's worsening conditions over time, or just that the progress is not fast enough between relative to the reference group in order to close the gap between different groups of the population. We have also primarily used demographic and health surveys and the multiple cluster indicator surveys. We've also made use of some of the decennial household and population censuses that are available through the University of Minnesota IPUM's platform, and to try to get a sense of indicators of social capital, trust, confidence in institutions. We've also used world value surveys as well. But the data I'll present today are mostly based on, or primarily based on, the DHS and mix. Like I said, there's a lot of similarities to the Multidimensional Poverty Index, and it's great to have that for us because the MPI then we can use as an entry point and a point of departure to make the case for the salience of further examining ethnic and racial disparities in development indicators, and for drilling down further to measure trends over time in specific indicators. So this is how we use the MPI in the last World Social Report. And just looking at the share of population multidimensional poverty, one of the issues we have is as a global report, we're always trying to synthesize the data to provide a global picture. And so on the last slide, I can talk a little bit about the challenges that we see and we face and that we would love to hear others' opinions on and thoughts and resources. But here what we've done then is just look at what we call the ethnic minority, which is another value-laden term, but basically the worst off ethnic group in a country, and compare that to the national average, just as in the MPI, just as a quick indication. I should say that the worst off ethnic group is in pink, and the national average then, is in blue here. And so it really sets the stage then to argue for the importance of disaggregating these indicators by ethnicity. We also use, the intensity of deprivation to make the case that there's a lot going on underneath here, and we really need to look at specific conditions and specific indicators, and ethnicity is just one of those characteristics. So the way that we've used then in the last report, the demographic and health surveys and the mix, was to look at child outcomes and to make the case that where you're born and who your parents are determine your opportunities in life, when really, I think, everybody can easily agree that all children deserve an equal chance in life. And so the point that we try to make this here is looking at indicators of stunting, is that there has been major progress in fulfilling basic needs over the last 20, 30 years through improved child health, increased completion of primary education, for example. And this has moderated the inequalities among some groups. But even in a simple indicator like stunting, unless progress accelerates, children from those groups that are furthest behind will remain behind by 2030. And so here again, we look at identifying, I should say these are looking at 3 waves of DHS and mixed data. So we limited our analysis for 3 waves of data, starting in the mid-1990s, going all the way to the mid-2010s. For ethnicity, what we tried to do then is in each country, identify the worst off ethnic group in 1990, and then see how those groups were doing 20 years later. And we've done the same then again for, these are all household head characteristics, so not only ethnic identification or self-reported ethnicity, but also looking at the wealth index that is used in the DHS in the mix, as well as the education of the household heads. So a lot of these disparities remain really significant. If we move to an indicator like secondary school attendance, then it's the same point: where you're born and who your parents are determine your opportunities in life. But here we try to make the point that gaps in more advanced accomplishments persist or are widening. So when you look at disparities in secondary school attendance by ethnic group, for instance, wealth quintile and education level of the household head, these have increased since the 1990s. So the degree to which development is leaving some people behind, and consequently whether development is promoting social inclusion, depends on the context as well as the indicators used to assess progress. Clearly, these are a result of historical context and path dependence. But we use this data, usually in the front of our reports, then to make the case that there's also room for policy action, because we see these different patterns across countries. And so we speak of 3 building blocks to reduce inequalities because of this question of how to reduce inequalities across ethnic groups. And again, there's every country context is different. There's no silver bullet for reducing inequality across the boards, but policies do matter, and government can do a lot to combat inequalities, both horizontal and vertical, and we don't make the distinction. We think that these are relevant policies for the different sorts of inequalities that a country may face within their national borders. So the first one would be to promote equal access to opportunity. And it calls for giving all children the same chances to advance their capabilities and reap returns to their education through decent jobs, regardless of where they live, the conditions in which they were born into, their parents' background. And these include policies such as education, health, and employment, labor market policies. But we put a particular focus on the universal access to quality education, in particular to expand access to opportunity. But that being said, a lot of times the education system has often served to reinforce inequality rather than help level the playing field. The second building block then that we talked to is, just generally aligning macroeconomic policy frameworks with social goals. So pursuing more progressive taxation and strengthening social protection systems. So in 2018, we did a report just on social protection and how this could address group-based inequality and promote inclusion of all. And so we have advocated this as social protection as a crucial element of national strategies to reduce inequality and a focus on removing the barriers that some disadvantaged groups face in accessing social protection programs and how these can help reduce group-based inequality. And then the final building block that we've put emphasis on is tackling prejudice and discrimination to ensure equal participation. I mean, discrimination remains a pervasive driver of inequality. A lot of group-based inequality persists irrespective, when we've done controls for socioeconomic status. So we take that as evidence that societies continue to make distinctions based on ethnicity, race, sex, and other characteristics that really should have no bearing on people's achievements or their well-being. And discrimination in particular challenges the ability of those affected to have their voices heard and their concerns translated into meaningful action. Addressing the root causes of discrimination calls for structural reforms, including providing equal access to justice for all and removing obstacles to political participation. And here our work a lot of times draws on what Rachel's done in terms of access to justice for people living in poverty and for addressing horizontal inequality as well. I will end on just some considerations for directions for future work. As I said, and I think Sabina and Fanni mentioned it as well, we feel this work is really important. This is definitely a priority for us in terms of continuing it. We're really grateful to be able to have this discussion with OPHI and then with everybody here today as well, in terms of how to make our work meaningful and how to push it forward, and how can, what ways can we do more to examine group-based inequality. But I put some questions here specific to our work on looking at ethnic groups. I mean, one is, of course, how to define majority and minority. In addition, Fanni mentioned just how ethnicity is a social construct. Majority and minority as well are value-related terms. A lot of times what we see in countries, Fanni presented the example of Nigeria with people who identify with the Hausa ethnic group, but the numerical majority is not always the same group that is most advantaged in terms of access to resources, opportunities, power, and voice. And so kind of trying to tease out those sensitivities and that kind of granularity is a work in process still, especially when we try not to highlight specific countries, but work at a more global level. And that leads to that the kind of corollary question then is how to conduct meaningful cross-country analysis when you have a multitude of ethnicities. And, is our approach in terms of trying to identify an ethnic majority or minority in terms of development indicators really the best way we can go about it? And so I think, these questions speak to the difficulty of conducting meaningful analysis of inequalities across ethnic groups and across countries as well. There is always a conversation on how to improve data collection on race and ethnicity. We've used DHS and mixed surveys primarily because they're available for a lot of developing countries. There's some consistency across them, but in the end, they are reproductive health surveys and surveys on maternal and child health. So we don't have the same kind of richness of other indicators that we might be interested in when looking at inequality, such as detailed labor force characteristics or income and consumption that you could get from a national household survey or a labor force survey. I will say, I mentioned before, we've used the decennial population censuses before, and previously in my role at the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, there's been a lot of progress in terms of advocating with countries on the importance of including a question on ethnicity and race, and there's some lessons to be learned there and some interesting things there. I'll just end on this. One of the other interesting questions we have, or something that we're interested in looking at right now, is not only differences over time, but also cumulative disadvantage and advantage over the life course. And so this is drawing somewhat on the work in the United States on cumulative disadvantage and advantage over the life course, specifically as it refers to race and ethnicity, and how this affects health and economic status and well-being, and particularly in later years. But the idea then that it's not just that these inequalities present in these different indicators, but that there's a cumulative effect over time, and how better to measure that. And then just the last point is, the unequal impact of COVID crisis brings renewed urgency to these questions. Any discussion around inequality and COVID-19 in many countries has had a very clear ethnic component to it, a socioeconomic component as well. And so there's big questions about what the long-term impacts will be, especially on group-based inequality. And so we expect to continue this work in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maren. And it's so good to hear both this presentation, but also about the continuity in the future studies. It is such an important area. And so we're really delighted to welcome Rachel Gisselquist, who's a political scientist who works on politics of developing countries, but has a particular focus on ethnic politics, as well as state building and democracy in sub-Saharan Africa. And she's also in the senior management team of UNU-WIDER, where she's a fellow, and she also leads projects like addressing group-based inequalities. So really the perfect discussant for these papers. And before I hand over the screen to Rachel, I also want to recognize with great gratitude Frances Stewart, who is of course one of the founding person of the idea of horizontal inequalities, and also their ability to mobilize latent conflicts between different groups. So we really look forward to your insights, Rachel. The screen's yours.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I enjoyed the presentations. I enjoyed reading the underlying reports. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. I wanted to highlight in my comments 5 points, and I know I have 10 minutes, so I'll go through these pretty quickly. But the first point is that, as these presentations have emphasized, obviously to meet the SDGs, in particular SDG 10, and the core principle of leaving no one behind, disaggregation by ethnic group is important, and a lot more can be learned from existing data, as I think these reports and analyses show really, really well. I'm not going to go through some of the things I really like about the presentations and the analyses, because you've just seen it so well. But just simply to emphasize that I think this analysis shows really clearly and very well, as the World Social Report for 2020 noted, that group-based inequalities are declining in some cases, but they're still growing in many others, or at least they're not declining, they're remaining constant in many others. And so the bottom line is that unless progress accelerates, leaving no one behind will remain a distant goal by 2030. The second point I'd like to highlight has to do with policy. So I think a lot of the discussion around leave no one behind in the SDGs is focused around measuring and documenting inequalities. And that's rightly our focus today, this afternoon or this morning if you're in DC. But I think ultimately the reason that we want to measure and document inequalities well is because we want to know better how to address them. And I think sometimes measuring and documenting inequalities very clearly informs policies to address them, but sometimes it doesn't. And so it's maybe useful to connect the dots a little more than we sometimes do in thinking about how really rigorous measurement and documentation can inform our policy responses. And so I suppose along those lines, I drew sort of 3 broad sets of policy recommendations, broad policy recommendations from the analysis. So one is, I think this analysis very, very well, right, identifies the groups that are being left behind. And so the groups that may require targeted assistance. Secondly, it identifies the dimensions or areas in which groups are particularly deprived. So as Maren's presentation highlighted, for instance, it might be that, you know, maybe access to healthcare is relatively equal across groups, but there are particular inequalities in terms of access to education. Or maybe primary education is pretty equal, but you see real inequalities emerging in the movement from primary to secondary school and beyond. And that's where we really want to focus our attention. And then finally, third, I think this sort of analysis highlights really well intersecting inequalities and the subgroups, especially, that are left behind. So for instance, you know, in many countries, it might be that women and girls in particular are left behind in this movement from primary to secondary education and so on. So when thinking about addressing inequalities between groups, we want to focus in particular on women and girls in disadvantaged groups. I thought, you know, when I wrote my discussant comments, I was going to ask the presenters to talk a bit about the policy recommendations emerging from their analyses, but I think it was really interesting then to hear Maren's comments on the 3 building blocks for addressing ethnic inequalities or horizontal inequalities emphasized in UNDESA's work. So I wanted to push a little bit on that. And I suppose, you know, as you see here, the policy recommendations that I see emerging most directly from this sort of analysis are focused on sort of targeted assistance. But it's interesting, I think, in your presentation that you're emphasizing, at least in 2 of the points, more universal type policies. And I wonder if you could connect the dots a bit more for us there. And then I suppose the second question here is that I think that this sort of analysis really does a lot to inform policies to address ethnic inequalities, but it's not sufficient, obviously. And in particular, I think it doesn't really give us leverage on understanding the structural or the political reasons for these sorts of inequalities. So, you know, if pointing out the inequalities doesn't lead the government to want to address them, what do we do? What do we do when there's no political will for addressing the inequalities? So I wonder your thoughts on that. And then finally, I would be really interested in your thoughts about the last question raised by Maren about COVID response and what sort of policy recommendations or thoughts you have in relation to the current pandemic from your analysis. So the third point I'd like to highlight has to do with data availability. And as I think everybody acknowledges, data availability is a challenge. And this means that cross-country comparisons and sort of global characterizations are often based on a very limited number of countries and a very limited number of data points. And this has several dimensions. So one dimension is that ethnic data simply aren't available for many countries at regular intervals. And I think this is illustrated very well in the OPHI report, where ethnicity disaggregation is done for 24 out of 101 countries. I think because, if I understood correctly, but please correct me if I didn't, because the sufficient data weren't available for the other countries. So this is quite a large amount of missing data. And I think it's important that we're clear about that and sort of take our global characterizations with a grain of salt, given this amount of missing data. The other part about data availability has to do with the fact that ethnic data, even when they are available, might be incomplete or difficult to interpret or just incredibly problematic, right? So, so part of this is conceptual. So ethnic identity, I think as Fanni's presentation went into really well, ethnic identity is diverse. It can be contextual. There may be multiple ethnic identities, ethnic divisions that are salient in a society. How do we know which ethnicities we should be paying attention to? Should we be paying attention to the ethnic divisions that are socially salient, politically salient, economically salient? What do we do when multiple lines of division are salient? And then in particular, I wonder, a question for the OPHI group is, how do you deal with what some people call nested identities? So for instance, someone in Bolivia might identify as a Quechua speaker, or in another context identify as indigenous. Both of those identities might be deeply felt and correct, if you can say an identity is correct, but they lead to very different ethnicity disaggregations. So I wonder, how do you decide when you look at one set of cleavages or one set of ethnic divisions versus another? There are also a variety of practical challenges, and I won't go into those. I think that Fanni's presentation covered them really well. The one, actually, on the practical challenges, the one small question I had was about using the ethnicity of the household head and how much intermarriage might play a role in affecting results there. Do you have any leverage on that by, say, comparing the mix results with the DHS survey data? So fourth, the other issue with data availability, I think, is that data gaps are also intentional. So I think in a lot of discussions, there's a lot of discussions around this leave no one behind agenda. There's an implicit assumption that if we put in enough money and we put in our technical know-how, that we will get better data and we'll be able to address the data availability issue and fill the data gaps. And I just frankly don't see this. I mean, the amount of missing data as I see it is huge, right? And there are a lot of reasons that governments, rightly or wrongly, might not want to collect ethnic data. So it could be, for instance, that a government which is dominated by one group simply wants to maintain its group dominance. It doesn't care about horizontal inequality. So it won't want to collect data on horizontal inequality or on ethnicity that could then be used to document horizontal inequality. The collection of such data could also be politically risky, right? So the numbers that document the effects of ethnically exclusionary policies could be used, for instance, by opposition groups to gain support and to call for reform. It could be that a government is really very open to addressing ethnic inequality or horizontal inequality, but it fears political division and tensions between groups. And so collecting ethnic data may possibly serve to heighten distributive conflict. So strengthening claims by disadvantaged groups, and perhaps in turn mobilizing advantaged groups to try to hold on to what they have. So there are reasons that even those governments might not want to collect ethnic data. It could also be that monitoring ethnicity arguably is counter to sort of the national project. And we see this very clearly in Rwanda, right? Where after the genocide, the official line has been, there's no ethnicity here, we are all Rwandan. So whether you agree with that or not, whether you agree with the not collecting ethnic data or not, there is research suggesting that the collection of official data, just the act of doing that, can cue citizens to identify in particular ways and can possibly reify particular ethnic divisions or reify distributive conflict around particular divisions.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm at my last point. So finally, fifth, I think, all this to say that I do agree that investment in data, collecting better data on ethnicity in household surveys is important, but I think this should be really qualified. First, as Sabina, you pointed out, right, there are risks. The bottom line is we want to do no harm. So we should keep these political tensions in mind. We should keep in mind that data can be used in ways that we don't intend it to be used. I suppose I don't have a simple answer, but at least being aware of that is a starting point. And sometimes I think it's missed in some of the discussions. I think we should also recognize that data gaps will remain in surveys, and we should think quite seriously about alternative sorts of information, especially qualitative sources of information. So I wonder your thoughts about how the extent to which you think these data gaps can be filled and what other sorts of information you might be thinking of using in your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are really, really splendid and substantive points. So we're very, very grateful. I think before turning it back, which I will shortly, to the panelists to respond or reflect on the questions, I'll give them a bit more time. And I wonder, Frances Stewart, since you are here, if you might have any quick thoughts or reflections or improvements that you might suggest.
First of all, yes, thank you, Sabina, and it's fascinating, and I'm delighted that you are able to do this, not just at one point in time, but over time. It's really exciting, and I think really interesting, the results that are coming out. Obviously, the minute you produce results, people say, well, what about this and what about that? And in some ways, I mean, by focusing on the poor and only the poor, you're sort of obviously missing out in terms of my agenda, which is to understand group inequality across a society, because it's not just who's the poor in the different groups. It might be a good proxy for that, but it'd be interesting to find out if we had some countries where we had the total distribution across ethnicities and compare it with your poverty one. I mean, your poverty one is absolutely the right one in terms of leave no one behind, but in terms of the politics of this issue, and which countries are really more unequal and less unequal, it may not be the best one. Secondly, I think it's very interesting the numbers which were brought up by Fanny, the numbers in the different groups, obviously, not only the numbers, absolutely, that's obviously very relevant, but also as a proportion of society, because I think that speaks a lot to the sort of policies that are feasible. I mean, if you have a general policy like we're going to address all poverty, but your very poor group is only a very small fraction of the total, well, then maybe you have to target them to capture them, because if you have a general policy, all right, we're going to try and give everyone high quality education and that will reach our group are going to be the one people who are not able to access that education. So then I think you do need targeted. If on the other hand, like the Hausa in northern Nigeria, they are half the population, well, you just must do some very generalized policies, no point in targeting at all. You must do it. So I think it's very relevant, the numbers, and I don't encourage that to go on. The whole data issue is fascinating, and whether you should or should not collect data. I'm very keen on data being collected. I feel people in society know perfectly well what's going on. And the fact that it gets in the public domain is just, in a way, an issue of transparency. So I don't know, I haven't seen the research which shows that collecting the data itself is going to cause the conflict, and I'd like to see that. But I think on the whole, openness is good. And I think most of the countries that don't want openness, like take France, you know, you can't count, there's plenty of informal surveys, so people know what's going on. But the French government say, oh no, we're all French, I don't know what you're talking about. And I think similar things are happening in Rwanda at the moment, which I think is quite dangerous. And it would be better if they recognize what's happening and then they might take some policies towards it. So on the whole, I'm against sort of suppressing it. In fact, I'm reminded that we were working in Peru, and in Peru, they were very against data and said, we're all mestizo, there's no difference. And then we did a survey of what people thought about racism in Peru, and we did it in other countries. And Peru was one of the most racist countries in the whole, all the ones we looked at, but they were saying, oh no, it doesn't exist, and then our Peruvian partners then agreed and started doing something about it. One other point, I thought, by the way, I thought Rachel's points were brilliant and excellent. But one point is about the cumulative advantage. That's very important over a lifetime, but I think it's also very important between generations. And that's one of the reasons why you get these entrenched inequalities. It's not only, let's take blacks in the US, that the blacks in the US over a lifetime are disadvantaged, but they've been disadvantaged for centuries. And it's because it accumulates. If you start, your children start in a bad position, the next generation do. And that's really the challenge. How can we break this cumulative advantage and disadvantage, particularly disadvantage, not now, but over generations and generations. Anyway, it's great. Thank you, Sabina, for giving me that opportunity.
No, thank you so much. So I think we'll probably go back to the panelists, and then James Foster will take it on from there. But maybe I go first to Fanny and then to Maren, if that's okay, to respond either to Rachel or to Francis's inputs.
Great idea, and I'll just jump in here and say, those of you who are in the audience, please go ahead and start putting your questions in the chat or hold up your hands, whichever. Carry on.
Thank you, Sabina, and thank you, Francis and Rachel and Maren, for your presentation and contribution. There were loads of very interesting questions, so perhaps I'll try to answer some of them and we can discuss. One which I thought was a really good point, Rachel, in your presentation, is about how monitoring ethnicity and also reporting ethnicity is very much a national project, and that is something that is very much on my mind and our mind as we working to expand the number of countries that we're covering. And data availability remains an issue, not only in the sense that the data is not collected, but that the data is not reported. And that is something that's politically sensitive when you're putting out information that is not publicly communicated by the government or the data agency who collect that very same data. And another interesting point, I think, is about the overlapping identities, especially in terms of ethnicity. I think that is quite common and something that we need to consider, and how we go about measuring that. So in our case, we go with kind of a very strict or a bit narrow definition that focuses on questions asking about ethnicity, as opposed to surveys that ask about your language speaking at home, or your mother tongue, or your nationality, which is present in some of the countries, but these are similar but not always the same concept, and it is very difficult to get a global understanding of ethnicity, because in some of the countries it's more racialized, in some of the countries it's more focused on the nationality or the languages or historical roots and historical events that has shaped those ethnicities. So I think these are ongoing challenges, and I don't think there is a global kind of one way of defining ethnicity. So that is difficult when we're thinking about comparison. And just another bit I would add about the practical challenges around using the ethnicity of the household head. So I think you mentioned, Rachel, that and that's correct, that in mixed surveys and multiple indicator cluster surveys, the question only is asked from the ethnicity from the household head, while in DHS, it is usually collected also from the other members of the household, which tend to be women and men of reproductive age. So in that instance, we can go and look at the households and if there is any difference in between them. For now, we have not done this work yet. We just do to ensure comparability across mixed and DHS surveys, but for DHS, that would be possible. And I'll stop now and I'll give over.
Thank you so much. And yeah, really fantastic questions and discussion. And I don't know if we'll have time to pick up on all of them. But one of the things that I did want to talk about was your questions around, the questions around political economy and what to do when governments are not motivated. And I think this also speaks to why we push for a universal agenda. So, and addressing inequalities implicitly is going to involve a balance of power and shifting the balance of power. And obviously that's one of the most difficult things to do in a society. And so the position that we've taken is to advocate for policies that are universal but sensitive to differences, because clearly there are going to be specific barriers that certain groups face in accessing universal policies. And so in the case of social protection, then, looking at, for instance, language barriers in terms of accessing information about programs or distribution points. So for us, by advocating for universal policies, it's more politically feasible then, because it's something that everybody can get behind, because everybody in the society will benefit, but also being sensitive to differences and being aware of the different kinds of barriers that certain groups can face and ways in which you can overcome those barriers that are group specific. And then, you know, somewhat address tensions within groups, because it's not just a policy that's specific to a certain group, but this is a universal policy. And I think I guess the other point that I'd like to talk about is, you know, data gaps are intentional. And a lot of times, you know, Fanny mentioned there is data, but it's just not disseminated. So one thing is, you know, when we talk about data availability, it's a lot about just dissemination of the data as opposed to actual collection of it. And that is, you know, I mentioned some of the work that the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean is doing in terms of censuses. So that was one of the points, was that, you know, countries were collecting this data in their population censuses, but then they weren't disseminating it to the general public. It was very, you know, you would get aggregate levels, but you wouldn't get the same kind of detail if you could actually analyze the data. And so there is a lot of times some quantitative data available, it's just not publicly available. The other thing is, I would totally agree with your point in terms of qualitative data. And that was one of, you know, one of the activities was actually working with different civil society groups in order to sensitize them and show them what they could say about group-based inequalities in their country on the basis of census data, but also suggesting that they could be a source of data themselves as a civil society organization that represents a certain group's interests, then to collect data on the population of interest and on their members, then as another way and leverage point, right, to use data to make their points. And I can think of two, you know, in the case of Fiji, when we were looking for data on persons with disabilities, like working with the CSO who knew, you know, Fiji's small country, there was a civil society there, but they knew, you know, more or less who their population of interest were, and thus they could go out and identify. I mean, you know, it's not going to be the same kind of nationally representative, you know, easily generalizable survey that you would get from the National Statistic Office, but it's another piece of the puzzle. And it's, you know, I think really what we've tried to do is try to triangulate the data, and so bring it up, bring different sources in to tell a more complete picture, because I don't think that quantitative data alone is going to tell us the full picture. And I'll leave it at there.
Okay, Sabina, as another co-author, do you want to put in your 2 cents here?
Thanks so much, James, and thanks to everyone. Yeah, just 2, I think, additions that are building on what others have said. Because of the variability in definitions, I think what I'm hearing from you would be sensible, which also strikes us, is that to use a richer data source like DHS and then pare it back and compare what would you do if you only use the household head versus if you use a more complex definition of ethnicity within the household having full information. And similarly for data sets that have the language groups or other ethnic identities, if you disaggregate by those and also disaggregate by this label of ethnicity, how might the findings be similar or different? And so I think trying to do empirical probing of the definitional implications of simply having data from the household head, which is disappointing, and also of different potential self-identifications, that'll at least populate this discourse with some numbers for this particular definition. And the other is Francis's question, and also a question in the chat about, in a sense, the non-poor. And I think it would be very interesting we impose a number of different poverty cutoffs that are published in OPHI's data sheets, including a union one where any deprivation identifies you as poor, vulnerable, which is 20% at least, up to poverty, up to 33%. And then also the severely poor with 50% or more. And in a sense, to disaggregate all of those, one could think of a situation in which the certain ethnic groups were much more prevalent among the severe poor, but you could also think of some that really come into view in the vulnerable populations. And so doing those would be sensible. I think the drawback is if you go to union identification where any deprivation counts you as poor, you could pick up cultural differences. For example, cooking with wood, we don't know if you have good ventilation, but there might be some groups that because of where they live will be more likely to cook with solid cooking fuel, and that may or may not be a deprivation depending on other ventilation systems. So a union definition and sort of bringing everybody in, we'd face with some of these data quality issues, but certainly it could be extended beyond what it is right now to just look at one cutoff, to look at least to the vulnerable and the severe poor. So I think that would be really interesting. So those are both easy to do in a sense technically, and I think would be interesting. So thank you very much for those. Over.
Great. There was a second part to that comment by Ricardo Santos, and it was saying, what about within household analysis as an opportunity? Maybe not to look at the intra-household, but into ethnically diverse households and intergenerational effects, including intergenerational ethnic transition. So this is a big question. So I'll put that out, and I'll also refer to one of our persons in the audience, David Ferreira Veronese, who is in Brazil, asking about, what's going on in terms of MPI studies in Brazil, and whether there's any discussion of specific social policies and institutions' impact on poverty over time. And so just look at the chat and you can look at the extent of that question, and I'll break it, throw it back out to the folks to address it. Whoever speaks first, speaks first.
I can say a little bit on in the intra-household element. So that is not something that we have done yet, but obviously this is of interest. I mean, I think tracking that over time requires very much, has a lot of data requirements. You would need panel data to kind of track those intergenerational effects, and I'm not sure that we are there yet. Perhaps some national surveys that are available would be able to those kind of analysis. But I think it will be interesting to look at inside the household and see that to what extent there is actually diversity in the households, because I think a lot of the time I'm not sure that I think it tends to be quite common that people don't cross ethnic or racial lines, although that also depends on the context of the country. But that will be interesting to see to the extent of it first, and then how that actually changes over time if there is data available.
Great, and let me turn it to Sabina for a quick discussion of Brazil.
No, thank you so much, David. Most of the work on Brazil is by Brazilian academics, and so I very much refer you to them. But in terms of the two particular questions, one was whether the MPI can be used and constantly updated to identify beneficiaries for targeted programming. And indeed, another number of countries, including Chile, including others in Latin America, use the MPI as a targeting device. And for that, it comes from either registry data or surveys of eligible populations who would like to apply to be beneficiaries. So that's on the data side. In terms of impact, there are two interpretations. Obviously, there's a monitoring purpose, which can and has been done, of simply monitoring the number of people who graduate out of being MPI poor. But there are also a number of RCT studies using the randomized data. And so OPHI have some of those papers, and we had a research workshop on impact evaluation in a multidimensional sense, where your left-hand side variable for the DID was some kind of an MPI that was project specific to the intervention in that country, or else was a national or global MPI. So those technologies are available, and it simply depends whether different programs have the data structure that can be used for them. Over.
So I'm going to ask for two more voices to speak up at the end. Maren, you haven't participated in this last bit, so I wanted to give you a minute to summarize or to say whatever is on your mind. And then Rachel.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to Ricardo for the question too. I think in terms of within household analysis. It's something that we had mentioned in the last report, but we didn't get a chance to look at. I'm not so sure in terms of ethnicity and changes in ethnic identification over time, but definitely in terms of gender relations within the household, intergenerational relationships within the household. It's something that we're trying to look at, and we're working on. I hope I'm not giving too much away, but we're looking at using the Luxembourg incomes study and seeing, because, and also to speak to a point that Francis has raised, in terms of looking at intergenerational effects and how characteristics of your parents characteristics of the previous generation can follow you over time. And so trying to pick up a little bit then on people's adults characteristics in their childhood and how that would affect their outcomes over time, and looking at that from a group-based. So there's not a lot of countries that have it, but for some countries where their ethnicity or migrant status is the other one that we're interested in looking at, nativity, and seeing what kind of stories we can tell there with data over generations and within households. Thank you.
Great, and now Rachel for a finishing touch.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been really a pleasure to comment on these analyses, and if you haven't read them, you do read them. I wanted to comment just very briefly to pick up on the question about overlapping identities and how to define ethnicity. And I suppose I would urge the OPHI team to, instead of thinking about whether you want to strictly look at ethnicity rather than language, rather than race, or whatever, to take a more inclusive approach to ethnicity, at least in some of the analysis, which I think is the way that a lot of work in ethnic politics is moving, to think about ascriptive identities more broadly. That would be probably thinking more about politically salient or socially salient ethnic identifications, whatever those might be, whether based around language or tribe or race or culture, broadly speaking. But I would encourage you to do that along the lines of what Sabina mentioned, probing different ways. But thanks very much. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you. And also thanks to the other speakers, including, of course, Sabina, Maren, Fanni, and surprising, the guru of horizontal inequalities, Francis Stewart. Many shouts out to our UNDP HDRO colleagues, Yanchin and Heriberto. I really appreciate your being here. That's it for today, and we'll see you next week when we discuss multidimensional poverty. Bye.